Last time, on Merritt and Karen, a state trooper is fired for speaking out about alleged misconduct in the investigation. Governor Arch Moore Jr. threatens other officers who might testify about the matter and lashes out at Morgantown's Dominion News. Close to the 6-year anniversary of Merritt and Karen's disappearance, Eugene Paul Clawson confesses to the murders. Hair is found in an animal's nest near where Clawson said he threw the girls' heads. He claims to have taken from them a necklace, a class ring, and a watch. Karen is believed to have been wearing her class ring on a necklace the night she vanished. Once he's back in New Jersey, Clawson passes a polygraph test containing 3 questions about the Coed murders. As he's awaiting trial, Clawson recants his confessions, saying that they had been based on a Detective Cases magazine story. In this episode, we look at Clawson's trials and the case for his innocence. Did Merritt and Karen's killer escape? And if Clawson didn't do it, who did? From Chromatic Media in the heart of Morgantown, West Virginia, this is Merritt and Karen, the WVU Coed murders. The trials we're about to discuss have left an indelible mark on this region of the country, and especially on the city of Morgantown. Forensics courses at WVU and elsewhere teach the case. The Innocence Project is even now working to clear Clawson's name, but the girl's legacy appears outside the formal rooms of academia and the halls of justice. It can also be found at high-energy house shows and in darkened Morgantown bars. They got their heads chopped off in the mountains. This is the song Merritt and Karen, and it was written by Colby White.
Frontman, vocals, guitar, Captain Catfish. That's F-E-E-S-H, Appalachian dialect. Stage name for about 15 years.
Colby has described the music of Captain Catfish as crypto-punk, which essentially makes him a punk rock folklorist. Bigfoots, UFOs, Mothman, ghosts. He can't seem to get enough of this stuff. And it runs in the family.
First time I heard about Merritt and Karen, the actual Coed murders, was probably from my father. He was always kind of into the creepier side of the Appalachian history, Morgantown history, and things like that. He was always telling me stories about, seeing Sasquatch and different things like that. But he was always fascinated with the Coed murders for the fact that they were unsolved for all that time. Everybody had their theory on, who did it or who didn't do it. He had his theory, and he took me downtown, showed me the spot where it happened. Then I found out the spot where the bodies were found. I've been fascinated ever since. My wife, I lived with her for about 3 years with her father. They lived on the, not the same road. They lived about 5 minutes from that road. So I got a lot of information from that.
The stories Colby has heard about Merritt and Karen aren't all from the historical record, the way they are for me. The woman who the defense claimed cut the hair that was found in the nest, that was Colby's aunt. His cousin has told him stories about playing with the Clawson brothers, which is to say that despite the irreverent tone of the song's lyrics, Colby views the track as an honorary part of regional and family history.
So this song, I refer to it as a tribute song, even though the lyrics are maybe a little violent and a little over the top. I know it goes into like that horror punk kind of Misfits sort of realm. And after I wrote it, I was kind of like, man, if the family of these, these girls hear this, I really don't want to insult them because it's not my intention. I'm very respectful to my surroundings and my local history. It's a song to let people know what happened. It's a murder ballad. It's not in ballad format. It's got a verse chorus, but it's like in my head, it's like a folk ballad. I want people to hear it and be like, oh, what's that about?
Aside from this podcast, the Captain Catfish song is the only modern representation of the girl's story we've seen in the realm of the arts. Despite our difference in style, we are engaged in the same project, preserving the legacy of Merritt and Karen. Colby is going to tell us a story later in the episode, but for now, we have a story of our own to unfold. Buckle in, because this might be a long one. We've been candid from the beginning about how Clawson's story ends. You know that he was eventually found guilty of the girls' murders. You know that the case went to trial twice. We'll go into why an appeals court granted the retrial before we're done, but we're going to cover both of Clawson's trials at once here because they were essentially the same. No important new evidence was introduced in the second trial. As strange as it may seem, you've heard almost all the evidence against him. We have one or two things to add, but for now we're going to examine why Clawson might be innocent by going through his confessions and all the evidence piece by piece. Let's start with the timeline of the night in question. We should probably begin by noting that Clawson's initial confession involves an extraordinary amount of travel. As we detailed last episode, he claimed to have driven 300 miles from Philly to his hometown of Point Marion, then hitchhiked 65 miles north to Pittsburgh, stolen a car, then drove 75 miles back the opposite direction to Morgantown. A total of about 440 miles through relatively remote regions in an era when there were no interstates.
Yeah, he punched out of work at Weyerhaeuser in Philadelphia at 2:21 p.m. By the time he got all this done, he picked up the Coeds between 10 and 11 o'clock that evening. So he did all this in 8 hours.
As anyone who has hitchhiked knows, the process can go very quickly or it can take a long while to find a ride. The inherent luck involved meant that police couldn't really test the second half of Clawson's timeline. However, several officers drove from Philly to Point Marion, the first 300-mile leg of Clawson's trip, to see how long it would take.
In the report, it was 5.5 hours. However, Richard Hall kept his own notes and said it was 6.5 hours. But say it was 5.5 hours. That still would only leave 2.5 hours to hitchhike to Pittsburgh from Point Marion and then find a car and drive down to Morgantown. That's still a very tight schedule. Not only that, he was supposedly hitchhiking to Pittsburgh carrying a machete and a flashlight and all sorts of things that would make him unlikely to get picked up. Also, the road from Point Marion to Pittsburgh at the time, most of that road was just a one-lane road, actually 119, the same road that supposedly the Coeds were left on, or left near. And it was a 2-lane road, and if you got behind any trucks, it's windy, it's 2-lane, you'd be lucky to get out of there to get to Pittsburgh in less than 2.5 or 3 hours. So
God bless the interstate.
The odds are not good that someone could do that in 2.5, 3.5 hours.
Well, not to mention finding a car
to steal.
And
finding a car that you can steal.
Well, I mean, were the keys in it? Did he hotwire it? I mean, does he have these skills? I mean, there's a lot. The dominoes have to be lined up for that to happen perfectly.
So to sum up, Clawson's proposed timeline is possible, but improbable. However, keep in mind that this was only the first of many confessions. One thing that will become very clear over the course of this episode is that the sheer quantity of Clawson's contradictions, changes of story, and evasive answers to questions is one of the things that's overwhelming about this case. Take, for example, what Sarah calls the hypnotic sessions.
And we have 4 of those.
This is a series of 4 hypnosis therapy sessions administered in New Jersey by a Dr. Babcock. Babcock ran his own hypnosis practice, but also provided evaluation to numerous law enforcement agencies. In one of those sessions, Clawson said he owned the car that he picked up Merritt and Karen in.
When New Jersey was doing the hypnotic interviews, Dr. Babcock was asking Clawson questions about the case, and one of the things that he claimed was that he had a 1964 white Cadillac that he had had for 2 months prior to when he kidnapped the girls, and that he drove that into Morgantown, picked them up, and the blood stains that the car received from this entire incident, he couldn't get out of the rug. And so he sold the car because he couldn't get the stains out, and he never really went into it. But in one of the versions, he gave the boots to his girlfriend at the time, who he described as a colored girl who shot dope all the time. And he was giving her the boots and the jewelry that he found so she could pawn it and buy more smack. In the second version of the story, the boots were in the car and he sold them with the car. In the third version, he took the jewelry and hid it in the stairs under his mother's house. So there was always this variation of whether he had a car or he stole a car, he hid the jewelry or he gave it away.
And I got a couple more variations for you. In the January 13th confession to Senator, he said that he drove a black and white Cadillac down from Philadelphia. However, when Richard Hall checked into it, he had been an hour and a half late to work because he had to ride a bus. So he didn't have a car at all on that day. And he said that the jewelry, he stashed it in a house next door that was kind of dilapidated and had since been torn down, where he said that he hid when he did something bad. He hid from his parents there.
Also, later on, the car went from white to cream because he wanted to get it straight with what he read in the article. That was the car that he stole, not the one that he allegedly owned and then didn't own.
And when they checked, he hadn't had a driver's license for a long time.
He also couldn't remember who he sold the car to because he didn't know his last name. It was a guy he met at a gas station.
Named John?
Yeah, John with no last name.
Yeah, several of the people that he sold stuff to and bought stuff from were named John with no last name.
Yeah, the guy who he called at work to punch him out was named John, but he didn't know his last name. He just knew that he was black and they had done time together.
Even trying to write this part of the story for the show has been difficult. You start with one basic component of the story, where the car came from, and suddenly you're lost in 20 different alternate timelines in which things are sometimes similar but almost never the same. It's maddening. Clawson's confessions not only differed compared to each other, but they also sometimes changed along with the investigation, like when they found the animal nest with hair more than 6 years after Merritt and Karen's heads were supposedly deposited nearby.
He suddenly amended his confession. He told Dr. Babcock, under hypnosis, "I lied about something." "Well, what did you lie about?" "I didn't throw the heads in the holes in Con Hill. I cut their hair off with scissors and I threw the hair down the hole. I took their heads to a coke oven in Fayette County and I burned them."
Even things that could be confirmed about Clawson's confession often ended up not helping much. For instance, Pittsburgh police said that a car had been reported stolen the morning after Clawson claimed to have stolen one, but it had been stolen from a lot that was closed for 48 hours previous. So it could have been stolen the day that Clawson drove to Morgantown or the day before, and we have no record today of what model that car was. And then there were the things that immediately appeared flat out wrong.
Was it ever proven that there was a watch taken?
To my knowledge, nobody was missing a watch, so...
Well, he claimed that the watch had a New Jersey address on it, so we were to expect that it was Merritt's.
I'm sorry, the watch was engraved with an address?
A New Jersey address.
Don't see that every day.
To give you a sense of how some of Clawson's dialogue sounded, here are portions of a transcript from one of the many interrogations.
After you turned off the main road and went down the dirt road with the girls in the car, do you recall where you parked?
I don't know whether I just drive in or... I don't remember.
You made the girls completely strip?
Yeah, I like nakedness.
Sir?
I like nakedness.
You took everything off, nothing at all left on their bodies.
I don't know whether they had jewelry on or not.
Other than jewelry?
I didn't take off the jewelry.
After you ripped through these things, you indicated in your statement these sexual perversions. You made them get dressed again?
Yeah.
Did they ever attempt to escape or get away from you?
I didn't give them a chance.
Could you describe to me one of the girls' underclothing?
No.
What did they have on, panties and a bra?
I think they had on panties and bra.
Did they put those back on?
I don't know. I don't remember.
Any other types of underclothing?
I don't know if they had pantyhose, panties. I don't remember.
Did they get dressed in the car or out of the car?
In the car.
Completely dressed?
I don't remember if they were completely dressed. I just told them get dressed.
And then you got dressed.
Yeah, I got dressed. Got my pants and my shirt, my boots, my undershirt, my shirt on.
You also wore a t-shirt?
Yep, burnt that up too.
What all did you burn?
I think I burned up that shirt, my undershirt, because I couldn't get the blood out of it. My pants had some blood spots, but you couldn't tell that much. My brother used to have a pit down by the house, a big hole down there, and that's where I burned them.
Gene, could you have burned the heads?
I don't know. I see in my mind throwing them in the hole.
Did you not remember throwing them in the hole?
I see myself throw them in the hole in there.
Did you keep any of their underclothing of the girls?
If I kept any of the clothes, it would have been their panties and maybe their bra. I don't know whether I kept any of those or not.
Do you...
If I did, they would have stayed in the car.
If they stayed in the car, what happened to them?
Left in the car just where I parked it. I want to talk about it if you don't mind. I'd like to quit talking, period. I'd just like to have something to eat.
Another of the interrogations was conducted by Richard Hall, who would eventually ask Jeff to write the book about the Coeds. Hall had been trained as an interrogator in the Marines and had a lot of investigative experience, so the head of the West Virginia State Police asked him to go have a chat with Clawson.
Richard was much more pointed than the earlier questioners, because he would question things. He would say, well, how did you see so well? And Clawson would say, I had a flashlight. Well, was it raining or snowing? And Clawson would say, yeah, one of the two. And Clawson kept, all the questions that Richard tried to pin him down on, he was either very vague, and he would fall back on, well, and I was high, I was tripping and smoking pot. I don't remember. Or he would leave these very open-ended answers like, well, yeah, one of those two. And he just could never be pinned down on anything. And Richard found that enormously frustrating. He also, as a investigator, as a interrogator, trained that way, he knew that people whose stories are really vague in general or way too specifics, either one of those are likely to be lying. It was all vague. He couldn't come up with any. He didn't supply any information. Richard would ask him questions like, well, was it a 2-door or a 4-door? And Clawson would say, yeah. And he just continually didn't. So Richard came away saying, he's lying. This is nonsense.
Hall thought that Clawson could tell he didn't believe the confession. After a few weeks went by without Clawson hearing anything about being charged with the murders, he sent Hall a letter.
Clawson said he's going to tell all his friends if they want to commit murder and get away with it, do it in West Virginia. He was taunting Richard, trying to get him to, bring a case.
It's also noteworthy that this was before LOL, so he wrote out, ha ha ha.
Yeah. But he did right at the end.
One of the interesting things about Clawson's various confessions, which may not have been realized at the time, is the way he integrated details from his previous crimes into them. I guess that could seem suspicious or make them more likely to be true, depending on your point of view, but having read through several confessions, Sarah seems to think the repeating details are evidence he manufactured them in Merritt and Karen's case.
Some of the stuff that he said in the hypnotic sessions, you can tell. So they'll ask him about something he's been convicted of where the victim lived and it can be corroborated. And he'll say, I had a gun, I made her lay down in the back seat. That's one of the details he says about the girls. Were they both laying in the back seat? It's like anything that he wasn't vague about, he was recalling from memory for something else. So whenever they would ask him something, he would directly contradict himself every single time. And he would be like, well, I did this. Oh, actually, it was the other girl. Actually, no, I didn't do that. Or I don't know because I had taken 2 tabs of LSD and I was high on reefer. So whenever he didn't know the answer and he knew that that was part of what would make it sound like he did it, he would just be really vague because he wanted them to just, okay, well, maybe he did it.
He has a description of a hot, tingly feeling that comes over him when he's about to do something very bad. And that description shows up in his confessions to other crimes that have been heavily corroborated and that seemed like he did do, and they had witnesses and everything. And then that same thing is what he says about Meriden Karen.
He also says something weird like, and then I came into my other body and I got really scared. Like, he talks about himself like he's 2 different people, and he does it with both crimes, the ones that he was convicted of and then the Coeds. And when he was evaluated for the Coed trial, it came out that he was a paranoid schizophrenic. So a lot of the things that he's saying he may believe, but it's not necessarily happening. He really thought the turnkey was poisoning his food. He was in a cell by himself in an abandoned section of the cell block where there weren't other prisoners, and he would tell them, he'd be like, I can hear them at night. They're really close to me. And there was no one there. So he was really unreliable, but he may have really believed that these things were happening to him. So that would be really easy to pass a polygraph test.
Right.
You really believe something.
And someone who is very compliant and does what people ask is more likely to pass a polygraph test, and they don't get alarmed at things. He was examined by several psychologists, especially in the time period running up to the first trial, to see if he was capable of standing trial. And most of them found that he was depressed and paranoid, but of course, you're in prison and you're facing a double murder charge, so being depressed and paranoid might not be that strange. But this was more important. Was he displayed inappropriate affect, which means he didn't react to situations the way you would expect people to. He had a fairly good long-term memory, but a very impaired short-term memory. So he just had no short-term memory, which would also speak to the fact that he kept changing his stories because he couldn't remember what he just said.
He was also on a lot of medication.
Yeah, he was on a lot of medication. Said he has poor social feeling, common sense, and impulse control. So that he was bad at all those things. And his IQ was between the 70s and the 80s.
Jeff used the word compliant when talking about Clawson's personality, which sounds like a strange descriptor for someone who was essentially a sexual predator, regardless of whether he killed Meriden Karen. I asked Jeff to expound a little on what he meant by compliant.
Psychiatrist Donald Carter, one of the things he wrote caught my eye. He said, when faced with, speaking of Clawson, when faced with overpowering people, this man appears to have a history of being gullible, easily duped, doing other people's evil wishes to somehow please them, and cannot stand up to pushy, authoritative, or powerful people. So he had all the personality earmarks of someone who didn't give orders, he took orders. And that's consistent with someone who's been in institutions as often as out of them throughout most of his life. He was either in a mental institution, or he was in prison, or he was in jail, or he was a pretty fully institutionalized guy. And even when he started in the army, in the armed services, I mean, even that is kind of like being in an institution. You're told when to eat, when to do things, and you do them.
He had been in prison for a long time. He had a prison mentality.
This is Dan Ringer, one of the 2 public defenders representing Clawson in the second trial in 1981.
He had an alarm wristwatch. They had been out for a few years, and he had the alarms set on his wristwatch for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Those were the 3 most important events in his life. He was on trial for murder, but by golly, that wristwatch was going to tell him when it was time to eat. That's just the way he had to live his life. That's what kept him interested.
Despite the fact that Clawson was a sexual predator in one sense, it also may be the case that the beheadings of Meriden Karen were a totally different type of predation. Please don't misunderstand us here. We're not performing moral comparisons of child molestation and murder. We're just pointing out that they are 2 different types of crimes.
all his other victims were, 12, 13, 14 years old. And the Coeds were 18 and 19.
And 2 in number.
And 2 instead of 1. Yeah. So it just doesn't fit. So, yeah, you're right. Both are dangerous, but it's a different kind of danger.
Well, he had done some things to his girlfriends. I think he uses the term lightly because he had claimed that he had problems with ED. And the only way that he could get it up was whenever he was physically violent. So he would only have sex with these women when he would hold a knife to their throat. But he never killed them because he was like, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. We're still boyfriend, girlfriend. He said that the reason that he couldn't get hard was because when he was 13 years old, his mother caught him with the neighbor girl and they were playing with each other, and she punished him by making him kneel on corn cobs for 2 hours. So anytime he ever thought of having sex with a woman, it took him right back to that moment and he just could not stay hard.
These details about Clawson's sexual behavior and capability seem at odds with the sexual components of the story he told about Merritt and Karen.
One of the confessions he did under hypnosis, he's claiming 3 different climaxes. That's pretty hard to imagine from someone who really has trouble with staying erect.
And in the one on the 13th, it was, I can't remember exactly, 5 or 6 climaxes.
Yeah, depending on who he was telling the story to and how interested they were, because he was deciding what they wanted to hear. So, oh, well, then I orgasmed this time. I mean, it just... 3 orgasms, 5 orgasms. It always varied.
And here's the thing with all these confessions about this horrific sexual violence. Merritt and Karen's bodies were fully clothed. Only Merritt was intact enough to test for sexual assault, but the medical examiner found no evidence of it. She still had a pack of cigarettes tucked into her waistband with a single cigarette inside. It's very difficult for me to imagine, after the kind of violence and degradation that Clawson describes, Merritt thinking, oops, almost forgot my last cigarette, as she's being forced out of the car to get dressed at gunpoint. In fact, both girls were still wearing their gloves. The court transcripts say that Merritt and Karen were neatly dressed, which usually means buttoned up, tucked in, looking as if they had just leisurely dressed themselves. And despite the detailed descriptions of sexual violence from Clawson, there are still all these basic things that he just doesn't seem to know or remember.
He doesn't know how to say Merritt's name because he can't pronounce it. Even though he would not have seen it written, she would have said, my name's Merritt. That doesn't sound so hard to pronounce, but he couldn't remember if she had dark hair or she had blonde hair. And he thinks that the blonde hair was either Carol or Karen.
But Ringer says that often, even in a world of DNA testing, a confession is all you need to put someone away.
A confession in a courtroom is really important. And there's such things as the CSI syndrome, where people expect to see DNA evidence now. We didn't even know what DNA was in a forensic sense. And in 1970, I'm not even sure that they were using it forensically at all. So things exist now that didn't exist then. There are more questions about confessions now, more questions about eyewitness testimony now. But still, if somebody walks into a courtroom and in a trial and says, here's the defendant's confession, and somebody else comes in and says, and here's the DNA, that person's going to be convicted.
Whether he was guilty or not, Clawson had tried so hard to convince everyone that he was, that there was no way a simple recanting of these confessions would keep the state from going forward with the prosecution. A prosecution that would become the most expensive in West Virginia history at the time, adjusting for inflation, more than $200,000. As we mentioned in episode 5, Clawson claimed to have learned about the story of Merritt and Karen from a detective magazine. And remember that 2 other inmates, Felton Harp and David Glass, had been the ones to offer Clawson up to the police. Trying to figure out their role and purpose in the confessions and abrupt recant is another maze of conflicting statements and rumor.
So the reason that he gave Dr. Babcock for why he even gave a false confession in the first place was because he had an agreement between Harp and Glass that he would pay their bail when he got out so that they could get out in exchange for them testifying so that he could get convicted. Because once he was convicted of the crime, he'd be like, haha, I'm actually an innocent man. Put me on the polygraph and I'll prove it. Your legal system is faulty. Only he had already passed the polygraph test. Now he was backpedaling furiously to make it look like he was an innocent man. So that's the first one.
He also stated that he wanted to get charged with double murder in West Virginia so that they would drop the charges against him in New Jersey. And then he would come down here, stand trial, and be acquitted because he wasn't guilty, and then he would just be totally free.
But then there's also this.
There's some indication that the idea was cooked up by Harp and Glass, and that their ultimate goal was to get the reward money. And it came out after the second trial that Harp thought the reward was $35,000. It was actually $3,500, so another in the comedy of errors here. But
also something you just reminded me, one of the reasons that Clawson thought he would be a good candidate to confess to this was he was actually born in Morgantown, West Virginia.
That's right. On Willie Street, just down from where the Coeds were picked up.
That is interesting.
Clawson claimed that he and Harp planned the false confession after reading the December 1975 issue of Detective Cases. Throughout both trials, Harp maintained that this was not true, and it turned out that Clawson wasn't even in jail with him during a significant portion of the time he claimed to have witnessed these nightmares. It is unclear whether the jury would have believed Harp anyway, no matter what he said.
He was what I would describe as a piece of work. I didn't know what to believe from him. One of the high points of the trial, and some people would think it's not funny at all, and other people would think that it is, we at least found it interesting, it was Felton was African American, very, very dark black African American. And the second trial took place in Randolph County. Now, Randolph County is not, or at least wasn't at the time, a cosmopolitan community. Everybody there was rural, white, go to church every Sunday morning. Felton was not that. So when he got on the stand, I'm remembering this now, when he got on the stand, he was very different from the people in the jury, from the people sitting in the courtroom, from the judge behind the bench, and the lawyers at the tables. I mean, he just didn't fit in. So Ed decided to try to impeach his testimony.
Ed is Ed Friend, Clawson's lead public defender.
And so he had his list of convictions. Now, in a criminal trial, you can use some felony convictions to challenge the veracity, the truthfulness of the witness. So Ed started down through that list of things that Felton had been convicted of. Mr. Harp, were you convicted of stealing a car in 1962? Yes. Were you convicted of shoplifting in 1967? Yes. And this long list. And finally he comes down to the ultimate moment. He says, Mr. Harp, were you in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I think's where it was, in whatever year it was, convicted of the abduction of white women? And there was a gasp. And all of a sudden, nobody wanted to believe or like Felton.
Later on, the defense presented the magazine to Harp in the courtroom and asked whether he had ever seen it before. He immediately answered no. In fact, he answered so quickly that the defense claimed that he didn't even have time to look at the magazine to see whether he recognized it. And here's the thing about the magazine, we don't have a copy. We've tried to find a copy online, but have so far failed to do so. I've posted the cover image to the Merritt and Karen Facebook group as we prepare to release episode 6. If anyone has or knows where we can get a copy of the December 1975 issue of Detective Cases, let us know. At one point, Jeff was given access to the evidence presented in the second trial, Defendant's Exhibit 14, the magazine. We don't have access to it any longer, but during that brief moment, with tons of other things to pore over, Jeff snapped a couple of photos of the cover and of the top of one page with the story. This gets a little complicated, so bear with me. Even though we don't have the magazine itself, we think we still have the article it contained. We were able to identify 2 different detective magazines that had published stories about the Coeds before Clawson's confession, and we think that they might be the same. The earliest publication of the article that we could find is February of 1973 in a magazine called True Police Cases. At least one paragraph of that story is identical to the article from Clawson's trial, as seen in Jeff's photo. We can only speculate why, but it seems as though maybe a writer sold the same story to 2 different detective magazines, first in 1973 and then again in 1975, when Clawson and Harp supposedly read it in a New Jersey prison. The byline of the article attributes it to Spencer Trent, which, from the sound of it, is almost certainly a crime noir pen name. The article doesn't restrict itself to hard facts. There's a lot of narrative flair, and a fair number of quotations and dialogue that the writer probably had no way of actually overhearing. As to how Clawson's confessions compare to the article, keep in mind that confessions contain the thoughts and actions of the supposed perpetrator. The article, on the other hand, as we heard last episode, is written in a voice that is omniscient of everything but the perpetrator, and focuses on the investigation of the police. So most of Clawson's descriptions about what he did that night aren't represented at all. But there are 2 important takeaways that I see. The first is this: the few times where Clawson's story and the article overlap, the article got the story wrong. For instance, the way that the bodies were positioned in the grave, which we'll hear more about in a moment. Clawson and the article get it wrong in the same way several times. The other takeaway is the movie theater. In episode 5, we heard about how West Virginia police drove up to New Jersey to talk to Clawson, Harp, and the other inmate who supposedly heard the confession, Glass. Jeff told us this about their questioning.
Harp and Glass both said that Clawson picked him up outside of a movie. And when Clawson was asked about that, he said, not where I picked them up wasn't no movie. And actually where Meredith and Karen were picked up was a block and a half away from the movie theater. There's no reason that anyone would have connected it to a movie.
Well, it's easy to understand why the police would conclude what they did. In the context of the article, the situation looks a little different. If there wasn't no movie where Clawson picked them up, why in the world would Harp and Glass have mentioned or even heard about a movie theater at all? The only way it makes sense to me is if they did, in fact, read the article, which opens with the girls coming out of the theater. Of course, that doesn't explain why Clawson's testimony differed and was more accurate. As always in this case, nothing is certain. Let's take a few moments to go over some of the exhibits presented at Clawson's trial. When I asked Ringer to lay out the physical evidence for me, he said this.
What physical evidence? There were things that were offered. A keychain was offered, and nobody could figure out what the relevance of it was, but there was a keychain, and so the prosecutor said, here's a keychain.
Okay, so we'll start with the keychain and a set of handcuffs that were found and given to police by a man named Clarence Leopard, a Point Marion native who knew Clawson.
He had found a keychain and handcuffs beside 119, the road from Point Marion south to Morgantown. A nurse at the hospital had seen Clawson with that key case. Turns out that the keychain and handcuffs were found in 1973, 3 years after Clawson supposedly discarded them beside the road, and 3 years before Leopard turned them over to state police.
Not only that, but the boot-shaped keychain was a promotional item for a candidate campaigning for sheriff's office. It had been created for the purpose of mass distribution and was very common. Then there's the machete, which supposedly belonged to Clawson's brother, James.
They got the machete from James. said to his knowledge Clawson hadn't used it to cut off anyone's head. But they found that James had been in Guantanamo Bay that day, so the original statement that Clawson made that he had borrowed it from his brother wasn't true.
And then there was the hair. Testifying in the case about the hair was
Steve Kanick.
So he's the chemist for the state police, which I believe they call it the CIB, the Criminal Investigation Bureau, where they do their tests for forensics. He had determined that none of the hair had roots. It was all cut. There were some that could have possibly have come from the girls because they were dyed and they were about the same color.
They had no exemplars. In order to match hairs, you need to have not only the root bulb is useful, at least at this time, back then. You need to have the root bulb, and none of these as you said, were all cut, but also they didn't have any exemplars, like from a hairbrush of Merritt or Karen's. They didn't have any examples of Merritt or Karen's hair, so they couldn't actually match them. In the media, Solomon, prosecuting attorney for the first trial, spoke as if the hair had been matched. The witness specifically said, "I can't match them because I don't have an exemplar," but they look kind of like the same color.
The girls' heads must have been thrown into that mine shaft because here was hair that was kind of sort of vaguely related to the color of the hair they were supposed to have.
In fact, one of the troopers said that some of the hair looked more auburn, which didn't match either of the girl.
We were supposed to have a hearing a week or so before the trial started about the hair. The hair had been discovered. And I got a call at home one night from a radio reporter, young fellow who was just getting started, named Hoppy Kercheval.
Yeah, Hoppy.
My name is Hoppy, Hoppy, Kercheval, Kercheval. I'm host of Metro News Talkline, a daily talk show, and also vice president of operations of the Metro News Radio Network. And I've worked for this company for 40 years, and during the time we're going to talk about, I was a radio reporter for WAJR in Morgantown.
And Hoppy called me. He says, "I understand the trial's going to be postponed." And I said, "Well, Hoppy, I can't talk about that." And he said, "Well, there's talk of newly discovered evidence." I said, "Hoppy, I can't tell you what the evidence is. So we're going to have a hearing on it, and we'll decide what to do." It was a cold call. He had no idea the trial was going to be postponed. He had no idea there was newly discovered evidence. And today, when I talked to him about it, he doesn't remember that call, but he reported it. I think he just guessed.
It was an infamous case. So when I came to school at WVU, people knew about it. People still talked about it. It was still discussed. It was still, even though it had been several years earlier, it was still fresh in the minds of people in the community. It was quite sensational that he was being brought back to be retried. And first there was a court appearance in Montague County. And after the hearing, Clawson was just sitting there. And I just walked up to him and stuck my tape recorder in his face, and I asked him, "Did you kill the Coeds?" And I remember specifically, he kind of said in almost a snivelly voice, he says, "I didn't kill anybody."
Could you maybe describe Clawson a little bit, like his appearance?
Yeah, he was medium height. He was thin. He was slightly hunched over. He had long, shoulder-length, greasy hair. He wore glasses, and he had this real, the word that comes to mind is almost like a snivelly character, like a someone who is ashamed or has something to hide or is snivelly was the word that kept coming to mind. Somebody that if you met, that when you met and spent a short period of time with, it would be easy to not like them.
That's a great description.
Yeah, that's very good.
And he was not a pleasant-looking person. He presented himself as the kind of person you would cross the street, a quote, decent person would cross the street to avoid. So the jury's sitting in a box. They're hearing all this story about this horrid murder case, this terrible defilement of these girls. And here was a guy who looked like he needed convicting of something. And I think most of us felt like they convicted him because he needed to be convicted of something.
Both of these guests were only involved with the second of the two trials, which took place in 1981, but they both had at least some familiarity with the whole case.
I got a copy of the transcript of the first trial. I remember reading through it. It just always, the description of what he allegedly did always seemed like a real stretch. That here's a guy who has his own sexual issues, that supposedly did all these things sexually with these women, and he was able to keep two of them, at bay and handcuff one and do something with one and then handcuff the other and do the other one. It always seemed pretty improbable to me. But who was going to let the guy go?
Mm-hmm. Well, but there's also the argument that, well, then that means somebody else out there did do it, and that's
sure. And that's I think that's always been out there. I think that's always been this thought that Clawson was not the guy. I think that's always kind of been out there. And maybe people on the prosecutorial side would say, well, tried twice, convicted twice. Well, the first time you got to throw out the first one.
The reason that Hoppe says you have to throw out the first trial is that an appeals court did, which is why there was a second one.
Oh, I think as I studied the case and studied the evidence introduced at trial, with almost 100% certainty, Clawson was innocent.
This is George Castell. He graduated WVU law in 1979. So like Ringer and Hoppe, he was still young when the Clawson trial came along.
Well, one of the clinchers to me is that the crime just wasn't committed with a machete. I mean, I had the sweater on my desk. I could see the hatchet marks in the turtleneck part of the sweater, the multiple hatchet marks. It was a hatchet. It was not a machete. So for the prosecutor to announce in the media that they found the murder weapon, the machete, when the prosecutor had to have known just from looking at the physical evidence it was not a machete.
The reason Castell had the sweater on his desk is that he was a law clerk for Justice Miller, one of the Supreme Court justices at the time. A big part of his job was reading through all of the appeals that Justice Miller took on, and then writing in detail his own conclusions. When I asked him exactly how much of the evidence he saw in this case, he said this.
100% of it. Everything that was introduced into evidence at trial. I remember people from the clerk's office walking down the hallway with several boxes of the physical evidence, placing it on my desk. I went through every bit of it, including, to my surprise, opening up just a folded paper towel that was just marked, Exhibit F or something similar, and not knowing what was in it and having the fingertips of the victims drop out on my desk. It was a case that I remember.
After Clawson was found guilty in the first trial, his lawyers appealed on several grounds. We don't have time to go through all of it, so we'll just focus on the two most important ones. The first was the autopsy photos.
The defendant asserts that the trial court committed reversible error when it admitted 10 color photographs of the victims' bodies as they appeared on the pathologist's autopsy table. The defendant argues that these photographs were not relevant to a single issue that was disputed in the case and served only to prejudice and inflame the jury. All 10 of the autopsy pictures admitted were 8x10 color glossy prints. It is difficult to describe a scene as gruesome as that depicted in these photographs. For 3 months, these human remains had lain in a forest, decomposing. The flesh over much of the body in Exhibit 5 is torn and missing. The investigators at trial suggested the flesh was eaten away by animals. Exhibit 5A portrays the body as it appeared when delivered to the autopsy room, clothed in blood-soaked garments. The right leg contains remnants of flesh and tattered clothing that taper to the point where the lower leg is eaten to bare bone. The right foot is missing altogether. Exhibit 5C is a color close-up of the same view with the clothing removed. Even more appalling, is that some of the photographs were taken after the chest cavity was cut apart by the pathologist and the internal organs were eviscerated.
The photos had no probative value, which is a fancy way of saying that they revealed nothing that would help anyone determine Clawson's guilt or innocence. They were apparently so disturbing that most of the judges wouldn't even look at them. The second important thing that the appeal claimed was that the prosecution had actively been spreading lies to the press, and therefore to the future jury pool. Castell says that's exactly what they did.
Very misleading statements like Clawson knew things in it that only the real killer would know, or only a person who was there would know. That struck me as totally misleading and absolutely mistaken. The hairs found in the mine shafts matched the hair of the victim. Also, just totally erroneous. So a lot of what today we would call false facts circulated about the case, and circulated because of, I think, statements, irresponsible statements, reckless statements made by the prosecution.
And as for what Castell thinks of the idea that the confession was based on the article, he totally buys it. Here's him reading from his notes on the case.
The magazine article contained a number of errors in describing the details of the crime. The defendant's confession incorporated many of the same errors. The defendant, for example, explained that he placed the bodies on their backs, side by side, and covered them with logs, the version given by the magazine article. In actuality, the bodies were found face down, crisscrossed, and covered with large flat rocks from a nearby stream.
The problem wasn't that the prosecution denied that Clawson was often lying. They just asserted that his lying was, for some reason, only relevant after the confession.
Solomon, the prosecutor in the first trial, pointed out that Clawson's a big liar, so how could you ever believe anything he says? When he says he didn't do it, how can you believe that?
But you should believe his confession.
But you should believe his confession.
But nothing after that, because he's a liar.
The conviction looked so flimsy that the court almost dismissed the case with prejudice, meaning that they wouldn't even be able to try Clawson again. So, as Hoppy was saying earlier, the first trial you have to throw out.
And then the second one, I never fully understood the verdict. I mean, life with mercy, first degree with mercy. Well, either you did it, and no mercy would be appropriate, or you didn't do it. It was one or the other. But first with mercy, and I think they came back in about 3 hours.
That fast?
I think it was.
This is not a crime that would warrant mercy. Nobody believing that Clawson was guilty would want him released after 10 years, or even 20, to commit the crime again. To me, that's an indication of a compromise verdict where the jurors have severe doubts about guilt, but just can't bring themselves to say innocent. My memory is that everybody who reviewed the objective evidence in the case either unanimously or almost unanimously believed that Clawson was almost certainly innocent. It looked like, with almost certainty, the wrong person, an innocent person, was in prison. But equally troubling was that whatever person or persons actually did commit the crime were still free.
But it was such a heinous crime, and Clawson was such a really kind of a despicable character, kind of a Weasley bad guy. Was any jury going to let him go? And I'm not second-guessing the jury. I'm just saying that I think it would have taken a lot for a jury to let a guy go, to let this guy go for these crimes.
Because they thought if he didn't do this, he's going to do something else any day now?
If he didn't do this, he probably did a bunch of other stuff.
Part of the problem may have been the prosecutor's opening speech, which we heard most of at the end of last episode. In those emotional opening remarks, he tells the jury that a verdict of innocent meant that Clawson went home a free man. This, of course, was not the case, as he was imprisoned for multiple crimes that would leave him incarcerated for a long time.
Because there was a lot of testimony about all the issues that he had, and I think you've explained that, where he had contemplated going through transition surgery that obviously was viewed very differently at that time. And I don't imagine this came out at the trial, but there were previous convictions involving minors. He really, again, was a profoundly sort of unlikable guy. And again, I just remember thinking as a person, not as a reporter, I remember thinking as a person, if he didn't do this, he probably did a bunch of other stuff and he should be in jail. You wouldn't have wanted to have been part of letting him go.
Castell feels differently about this point.
This case needs to be re-examined, especially as forensic science developed. I mean, today, not just today, but a decade ago, when Clawson was still alive, we could have subjected the hair in this case to mitochondrial DNA testing. So I periodically recommended to Morgantown lawyers that somebody should make the effort to see if the hair has been saved and tested today. It would almost certainly not be victim hair. And would then constitute newly discovered evidence that would meet the legal criteria for overturning Clawson's conviction and reopening the case.
It's been 47 years since the headless bodies of the two Coeds were recovered, 36 since Clawson was convicted for the second time and sent away in an attempt to give closure to the case. But with the mercy verdict issued as a compromise by those second-guessing reasonable doubt, the state had merely placed a Band-Aid on an injury inflicted not only upon the people that loved Merritt and Karen, but to every woman that ever found herself vulnerable in this particular college town. With the passing decades, the newspapers talked about Merritt and Karen less. Hitchhiking was replaced with Uber, and students were no longer cautioned to keep an eye on suspicious strangers. It might seem that Morgantown moved on, lost the memory of a terror that ruled its citizens in 1970, forgot about the girls. But Merritt and Karen refused to be forgotten, transcending the tragic headline genre by becoming folklore and legend.
My youngest son graduated from WVU in 2002, and it was the late fall of 2001, Halloween time. He came home and said, "Dad, let me tell you about the ghost story." I said, "What ghost story is that?" He said, "About the two headless Coeds." I said, "Well, tell me about it." And so he started telling me about this story, this ghost story that's going around campus. And I kept correcting him about details in the story. And he finally got frustrated with me. He says, "How do you know so much about this?" Well, I was sort of there.
I said we would be coming back to Colby of Captain Catfish, and here we are. I asked him if, as our resident folklorist, he would send us out with one of the ghost stories he'd heard about Merritt and Karen. As it turns out, his wife's father worked at a machine shop very close to where the bodies were found.
Two of his employees both collaborated on the same story. It was the late 90s. It was around March. We had a massive snowstorm. They were getting ready to leave, basically close up shop for the night. It was around 11 o'clock at night. These two girls come out of that road, very distressed, panic looking, had not really clothes that you would think would be appropriate for that time of year, like light windbreaker sort of stuff. They said there were 4 or 5 dogs surrounding them, just stray dogs surrounding them. They came across the road, used the phone, they called a number. This was before caller ID, you couldn't really trace who they were calling. They offered to give them a ride to where they needed to go. They said they needed to be dropped off downtown. So the two girls pile into the one guy's truck, while the other employee followed them to the interstate. You know, it's snowing really bad, the roads were really terrible. They almost get to the interstate and the girls start panicking once again. They start, freaking out. They want out of the car. The guy's trying to calm them down. He's like, "Well, I'll just drop you off downtown." He's like, "You don't want to be here in the winter. It's terrible outside. There's nowhere for you to go. You're going to freeze to death, basically." Well, they wouldn't stop freaking out, so he stopped. They got out of the car. walked behind his truck, went over the guardrail, down into a field where the only thing that was there and that is not there any longer was just this old abandoned shack, like a little shed looking thing. That's the only thing that was there. The employee behind him also saw them go around his truck, cross the guardrail, down into the field. They both got out of their vehicles, no footprints in the snow. It's almost like they, vanished into thin air, hence the vanishing hitchhiker story. To this day, they don't know where they went or if they were, even physically in the vehicle.
I recorded this interview on a beautiful day. My studio windows open, even though it's bad for recording sound. The sun never stopped shining, but as Colby finished telling his story, rain began falling outside, first gently striking the windowsill beside us, then pouring. It did not escape Colby's attention.
As far as other creepy things, I'm thoroughly enjoying that we're talking about ghost stories and it's sunshine and raining right now. I believe a lot in maybe coincidence, maybe not, maybe things happen for a reason. So I think this is a pretty good sign that somebody knows that we're talking about them.
I consider myself a pretty skeptical guy. I don't know if Merritt and Karen had anything to do with the rain, but I hope, if there is some afterlife, that they would approve of what we've tried to accomplish on this show. A sign of that is a comforting thought, even if I choose to let the thought pass and return to a world that, like Merritt and Karen's story, is full of uncertainty. That's all for us here at Merritt and Karen for a little while. We've covered the major plot points up to the final conviction of Clawson, and it's a good spot for a hiatus. But later this year or early next year, I'll be coming back with Jeff for a 2-episode continuation. Almost everything you've heard so far has been from the historical record. When we return, the case is reopened by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hall in 2006, 35 years after the conviction of Clawson. Jeff shadows Hall for nearly 3 years and gives us his personal account of their investigation, including who he believes killed Merritt and Karen. One of the characters from episode 4, Slaughter, the janitor, comes back into play, and we hear about a relative of his who ended up being an even more interesting suspect. We look at a Clarksburg native implicated in the murders of over 30 women, we talk to forensic specialists who still use the case in classrooms, and more. Of course, we'll also make sure to release a quick notification when that book that Jeff and Sarah are working on, detailing this case, is finally complete, so keep that podcast subscription locked in. This show is a passion project of Chromatic Media. All episodes are free and without advertising. Check our website at chromatic.media, that's KROMATIC.media for all episodes, photographs, old newspaper clippings, links to the music and musicians, and more. And as always, if you enjoyed the show, take 2 seconds to rate it on your podcasting service to help other listeners find good stuff. Merritt and Karen is produced by myself and Sarah Gibbons with lots of assistance from Jeff Fuller. Huge thanks to Hoppy Kirchhoff, Dan Renger, and George Castell for speaking with us this episode. Clawson was voiced by Chris McLaughlin, and his interrogator was voiced by Winston Fuller. Our theme song and other instrumentals throughout the show are written and performed by John Smithers, Nick Larson, and Annie Stroud. Those tracks were produced by Nathan Snyder. All the music you heard in today's episode and in all of our episodes was written and recorded by Morgantown musicians. First up, we had Merritt and Karen from Captain Catfish.
They got their heads chopped off in the mountain state. It was a long walk home. They were running late with the pretty little necks and their pretty faces. Got their heads chopped off in the mountain state. Just a passerby
Sandra Black with Evil.
takes your things. Will lie and say that believe me and be okay. And take my alleviate, and they take my.
Our most used artist, Ordo Templi Sonica, with Hall of Dagon. The Foolish with I Know the Stars. Golden Horseshoe with Fever Dream 1, and finally Good Wolf with a track titled Intro from their Shitty Kids album. Thanks to everyone who continues to make this project possible. Take care.